The morning sky over New Haven Colony burned in shades of purple and orange as the twin suns rose over the horizon. Commander Jake Morrison stood at the window of the Defense Command Center and watched the farmers heading out to their fields in the distance. The colony had been running for 3 years now, and everything was working better than anyone back on Earth had hoped for. 50,000 people called this place home now, and every day more supplies arrived from the Sol system to help them build something new and peaceful, far away from all the old problems that Earth carried on its back. Jake sipped his coffee and checked the defense grid display behind him. Everything showed green across the board. The sensor net extended 3 million kilometers out into space and watched for asteroids or debris that might threaten the colony. They had never been designed for military threats because humanity had never met another intelligent species out here among the stars. Sure, there had been bacteria on Mars and some interesting crystal formations on Europa, but nothing that could build ships or send messages. Humanity was alone as far as anyone knew, and Jake was fine with that. His communication officer, Lieutenant Amy Grant, sat at her station running through the morning checks. She was young, maybe 25, with bright eyes that still held excitement about being out here on the frontier. Jake remembered having those same eyes once, back before he had seen 3 tours in the resource wars back home. Amy hummed while she worked, some old song her grandmother taught her, and Jake smiled at the sound. This was what they had come out here for, to build something where people could hum while they worked instead of checking over their shoulders for the next attack. The alarm changed everything in less than a second. Every screen in the command center flashed red at once. The sensor net had detected something big dropping out of faster-than-light travel at the edge of the system. Jake dropped his coffee mug and ran to the main display. Amy stopped humming and her fingers flew across her controls to get more information from the sensors. What they saw made no sense at first. 12 contacts, each one the size of a skyscraper, moving toward New Haven on a direct intercept course. The ships did not look like anything in the human database. They were organic, like someone had grown them instead of building them from metal and composites. Long tendrils extended from bulbous central bodies, and they pulsed with light that seemed to move through them like blood through veins. Jake felt his throat go dry. This was it. This was first contact. This was the moment that humanity had wondered about and dreamed about and feared for centuries. He reached for the communication controls with shaking hands. Amy beat him to it. She was already sending out the standard first contact package that every colony had been given before they left Earth. It contained mathematics and physics and images of humans and greetings in every language that Earth had ever spoken. It was supposed to show whoever received it that humans came in peace and wanted to talk and learn. The response came back in 90 seconds. The alien ships did not slow down. Instead, they accelerated toward New Haven, and their weapons ports opened like flowers blooming in fast motion. Jake slammed his hand down on the evacuation alarm, and the sirens began wailing across the entire colony. He grabbed the microphone that connected to every speaker in every building and every street corner. His voice came out, steady even though his hands were shaking, hard enough that he had to grip the microphone with both hands. He told everyone to get to the evacuation shelters immediately and not to stop for anything or anyone. He told them this was not a drill and that they needed to move right now. Amy was crying at her station, but her hands never stopped working. She activated every defense the colony had, which was not much. 3 missile platforms designed to shoot down asteroids. A dozen point defense lasers meant to clear debris. None of it was designed to fight actual warships. New Haven was a farming colony, not a military base. The alien ships entered orbit, and the first shots fell from the sky like meteors made of pure light. The eastern farming district simply vanished in a flash that left after images burned into Jake's vision. The communication array exploded and threw debris across 3 city blocks. The medical center collapsed into its own foundation and buried everyone, inside under tons of concrete and steel. Jake watched it all happen on the screens and could not make himself look away, even though every instinct screamed at him to run. This was his command. These were his people. He had promised to protect them when he took this job, and now he watched them die while he stood helpless in a command center that could do nothing to stop it. Amy was screaming into her headset, trying to reach the transport ships in orbit and tell them to get away while they still could. One of them listened. The cargo hauler New Dawn broke orbit and began accelerating away from the planet as fast as its engines could push it. Amy was supposed to be on that ship. She had been scheduled for a supply run back to Earth starting today. Instead, she had come to work early because she liked watching the sunrise from the command center windows. The alien ships fired again and again. They were methodical about it. They hit the power plants first, then the water treatment facilities, then the schools and hospitals and residential blocks. They were not just attacking military targets. They were killing everything and everyone they could find. Jake armed the colony's self-destruct system because he would not let them have the technology and research that humans had worked so hard to build. Then he grabbed Amy by the arm and dragged her toward the emergency escape tunnel that led down into the planet's cave systems. She fought him at first, still trying to reach people on her headset, but he was stronger and he pulled her along behind him. They made it 50 meters down the tunnel before the command center took a direct hit. The explosion picked them both up and threw them against the tunnel wall hard enough to crack Jake's ribs. The lights went out and emergency strips along the floor provided the only illumination as they stumbled deeper into the darkness below. Behind them, above them, all around them, New Haven died. 50,000 voices fell silent one by one as the alien ships turned the entire colony into ash and molten stone. It took them 4 hours to complete their work. When they were done, nothing remained that could sustain human life. The air burned with toxic smoke. The water boiled away into poisonous steam. The soil turned to glass under temperatures hot enough to melt titanium. Jake and Amy huddled in the darkness and listened to their home die. The emergency session of the United Earth Council met 6 hours after the last transmission from New Haven went silent. Director Peter Hayes sat at the head of the table and watched the recording that Amy Grant had managed to upload to the New Dawn before the transport ship jumped back to Earth. The footage showed everything in brutal clarity. The alien ships arriving without warning, the attacks that followed with mechanical precision, the systematic destruction of every structure and every life on the colony world. Peter had seen combat footage before during his years in the military, but this was different. This was not soldiers fighting soldiers. This was extermination. The aliens had not tried to communicate beyond that single reply. They had not demanded surrender. They had not taken prisoners. They had simply erased 50,000 human lives from existence like someone clearing data from a computer. The council chamber held representatives from every nation on Earth, and every one of them sat in stunned silence as the footage played for the third time. When it ended, the room erupted into shouting. Some demanded immediate retaliation. Others called for caution and investigation. A few even suggested that humanity should pull back from space entirely and focus on defending the Sol system. Peter let them argue for 15 minutes before he brought his hand down on the table hard enough to crack the wooden surface. The room fell silent and every eye turned to him. He stood slowly and his shadow fell across the table like a blade. He told them that the aliens had sent a second transmission after they finished destroying New Haven. The translation computers had worked on it for 4 hours before they could make sense of the alien language patterns. The message was simple. Humanity had violated territorial claims by establishing New Haven in space that belonged to something called the Zethrid Collective. The destruction of the colony was considered a legal enforcement action under galactic law. Humanity was ordered to cease all expansion beyond the Sol system or face additional enforcement. The council chamber erupted again, but this time the anger was unified. These aliens, these Zethrid, had murdered 50,000 civilians and then had the audacity to call it legal. They had threatened humanity with more violence if humans dared to leave their own solar system. They had drawn a line and expected humanity to accept it without question. Peter called for a vote on the proposed response. Every hand went up in agreement. Not a single dissenting voice. Not one call for negotiation or diplomacy. The vote was unanimous and it authorized the immediate mobilization of every military asset that Earth possessed. General Linda Carter took command of the newly formed Terran Expeditionary Force 3 days later. She was 52 years old and had spent 30 of those years in uniform. She had commanded troops in the resource wars where nations fought over water and rare earth minerals. She had seen cities burn and populations starve. She knew what war cost, and she knew that sometimes the only way to stop a bully was to hit back harder than they hit you. Her orders from the council were clear. Find every Zethrid military installation, colony, and ship. Destroy them all. Leave nothing that could threaten humanity. Do not negotiate. Do not accept surrender. Show them what happens when they attack humans. Linda assembled her command staff in the war room beneath the Geneva headquarters. She looked at the faces around the table and saw the same cold determination in their eyes that she felt in her own chest. These were not people who wanted war. These were people who understood that sometimes war chose you whether you wanted it or not. The scientific community mobilized alongside the military with a speed that surprised everyone. Dr. Alan Price led a team of physicists and engineers who had lost family members at New Haven. His daughter had been a teacher at the colony school. She had been 28 years old. Alan had seen the footage of the school building collapsing under alien fire, and he had not slept since. He brought General Carter designs for weapons that had only existed in theoretical papers before. Antimatter warheads that could vaporize entire city blocks. Railguns that could fire projectiles at a significant fraction of light speed. Swarms of microscopic machines that could break down matter at the molecular level. Every nightmare scenario that scientists had ever imagined was suddenly getting funding and construction. Timelines, the shipyards above Earth, and Mars worked around the clock building the fleet that would carry humanity's response to the Zethrid. The largest ship was the ECS Retribution, a warship 3 kilometers long and bristling with enough weapons to level a continent. Captain Nicole Brooks took command of the Retribution and handpicked her crew from volunteers who had all lost someone at New Haven. Nicole had been a commercial pilot before the attack. Her wife had been an engineer at New Haven. Her 2 sons had been in elementary school there. She had recordings of them singing happy birthday to her over the communication link just 2 days before the attack. Now she stood on the bridge of the most powerful warship humanity had ever built, and she had only one purpose left in life. The Retribution and its escort fleet left Earth orbit 6 months after New Haven died. They carried 800 crew members and enough firepower to crack a small moon. Their first target was a Zethrid mining operation in the Tau Ceti system. Intelligence suggested it held around 12,000 workers and minimal military defenses. The fleet dropped out of faster-than-light travel at the edge of the system and began the approach toward the mining station. The Zethrid sent a communication demanding identification and stating that this was restricted space under collective jurisdiction. Nicole did not bother responding. She simply gave the order to charge all weapons and prepare to fire. The Zethrid station seemed to realize what was about to happen in the last few seconds. Their defensive systems came online, and they began broadcasting distress calls to other collective facilities. They demanded to know why humans were attacking. They insisted this was a violation of galactic law. They threatened retaliation. Nicole ignored all of it. She thought about her sons and how they had been scared of thunderstorms. She thought about her wife and the plans they had made to retire to New Haven in a few years. She thought about 50,000 people who had died for the crime of existing in space that someone else claimed to own. She gave the order to fire, and every weapon on the Retribution and its escort ships opened up at once. Missiles crossed the distance in seconds. Energy beams carved through the station's structure like a hot knife through butter. The railguns fired projectiles that hit with the force of small nuclear weapons. The entire engagement lasted 4 minutes from first shot to complete destruction. When it was over, the mining station and everyone on it had ceased to exist. Nothing remained but expanding clouds of debris and superheated gas. Nicole watched it all on her displays and felt nothing except a cold satisfaction. She opened a channel back to Earth and reported to General Carter in a voice that could have been discussing the weather. Target neutralized. No survivors. No witnesses. Moving to next objective, General Carter received the report in her command center and allowed herself a small smile. She opened the fleet-wide channel and broadcast new orders to every human warship now prowling through space hunting for Zethrid targets. All ships were authorized to engage any Zethrid presence on site with extreme prejudice. No warnings required. No quarter given. No prisoners taken. The Zethrid had wanted to teach humanity about their rules and their laws. Now humanity would teach them that rules only mattered if both sides agreed to follow them. The Galactic Council convened an emergency session on Axiom Prime, a massive space station that had served as neutral ground for 17 different species for over 2,000 years. The council chamber was a circular room with seats arranged in tiers so that every delegation could see every other delegation clearly. Holographic displays floated in the center, showing star maps and casualty reports and footage from destroyed Zethrid facilities. Ambassador Trell of the Vaxian Union stood at the central podium, with his forearms spread wide in a gesture of concern. The Vaxians were an old species, one of the founding members of the Council, and they took their role as peacekeepers very seriously. Trell had served on the Council for 30 years, and he had never seen anything like what the humans were doing. He activated the holographic display, and the room filled with images of destruction. A Zethrid colony world where the orbital infrastructure had been systematically destroyed, leaving 3 million inhabitants stranded on the surface without power or water. A mining fleet that had been caught in deep space and reduced to expanding debris fields. A research station that had simply vanished, with no survivors and no wreckage large enough to identify. Trell spoke in the formal council language that all members understood through translation implants. He told them that in 6 months the humans had killed over 4 million Zethrid across 15 different star systems. They attacked without warning. They ignored all attempts at communication. They refused to acknowledge any rules of engagement or conventions of warfare. They were, in his words, acting like savages who had no place among civilized species. The council chamber filled with the sounds of agreement from most of the delegations. The Morsidians clicked their mandibles in approval. The Krell hummed their support. The Forians flashed their bioluminescent patterns in patterns that meant disgust and concern. But High Arbiter Senna of the Council Oversight Committee raised one scaled hand, and the chamber fell silent. Senna was old, even by the standards of her long-lived species. She had been present when the Council had first formed, and she had seen countless wars and conflicts resolved through diplomacy and careful negotiation. Her voice carried weight that no other member could match. She asked Trell a simple question. Where was the Council when the Zethrid destroyed New Haven? Where was the emergency session then? Where was the outrage when 50,000 humans died without warning or mercy? Trell opened his mouth to respond, but Senna continued speaking. She brought up the official record showing that the Zethrid had reported the destruction of New Haven as a legal enforcement action. The Council had received the report and filed it without investigation or intervention. No one had questioned whether the Zethrid claim to that space was legitimate. No one had asked if exterminating an entire colony was a proportional response. The Council had simply accepted it and moved on. The chamber erupted into arguments and accusations. Some delegations insisted that the Zethrid action had been legal under existing territorial conventions. Others pointed out that those conventions had been written before humanity had joined the galactic community and perhaps needed to be reconsidered. A few suggested that both sides were at fault and that the Council should impose sanctions on everyone involved. Senna waited for the noise to die down before she spoke again. She told them that the Council had failed in its primary purpose, which was to prevent exactly this kind of spiral into total war. They had allowed the Zethrid to commit what the humans clearly considered genocide. Now they were surprised that the humans had responded with overwhelming violence. She asked what any of them would have done if another species had destroyed one of their colony worlds and then threatened them with more violence if they objected. The chamber fell silent again because none of them had a good answer to that question. Meanwhile, in Zethrid space, the war continued without pause. Commander Kyle Bennett led a strike force of 6 ships toward a Zethrid colony world called Verath III. Intelligence reports indicated it had a population of 30 million with minimal military defenses. The planet was primarily agricultural, growing food that supplied other Zethrid worlds throughout their territory. Kyle sat in his command chair and reviewed the mission parameters for the 10th time. His orders were to destroy military infrastructure only: power plants, communication arrays, spaceports, manufacturing facilities, anything that could support the Zethrid war effort. His orders specifically prohibited targeting civilian population centers. But as his ships entered orbit around Verath III, Kyle looked at the planet below and tried to figure out where the line was between military and civilian. The power plants provided electricity to homes and hospitals as well as military bases. The spaceports handled civilian traffic alongside military transports. The manufacturing facilities made farm equipment and medical supplies as well as weapons and armor. His tactical officer, Lieutenant Paul Martinez, pulled up targeting solutions on the main display. He highlighted the primary power generation facility, that sat on the outskirts of the largest city. Taking it out would cripple the planet's infrastructure, but it would also leave 20 million people without electricity. In the middle of winter, Kyle thought about the briefing he had attended before this mission. They had shown footage from New Haven, images of the school where children had been incinerated in their classrooms, pictures of the hospital where patients had burned in their beds, video of residential blocks collapsing while families slept inside. He gave the order to fire on the power plant and watched as missiles streaked down through the atmosphere. The facility exploded in a flash of light that was visible from orbit. Seconds later, the lights across the entire continent below went dark. Paul brought up the next target and Kyle approved it without hesitation. Then the next one and the next one. By the time his strike force left orbit 3 hours later, Verath III had been bombed back into a pre-industrial state. Millions would die in the months that followed from starvation and disease and cold. Kyle wrote in his personal log that night that he had followed his orders to the letter. He had only targeted military infrastructure. He had not fired on civilian centers, but he knew that the result was the same. He had killed more people today than had died at New Haven, and he had done it from orbit without even seeing their faces. Back on Axiom Prime, the Galactic Council continued to debate. Ambassador Trell presented a formal resolution calling for immediate intervention against humanity. The combined fleet, representing the military power of 12 different species, would be authorized to use force to stop the human rampage through Zethrid space. The vote was called, and delegations around the chamber activated their voting crystals. Green for approval, red for rejection, yellow for abstention. The results appeared on the central display and showed a split decision. 7 species voted for intervention, 6 voted against, 4 abstained. The resolution failed to pass because it required a 2/3 majority for military action. The council was paralyzed by its own rules and procedures while humans in Zethrid continued to kill each other across dozens of star systems. High Arbiter Senna watched the vote tally appear and shook her head slowly. She had seen this pattern before in her long life. Violence created more violence. Revenge demanded counter-revenge. The cycle continued until one side was completely destroyed or both sides were exhausted beyond the ability to continue fighting. She wondered which outcome awaited humanity and the Zethrid. She wondered if the council would still exist by the time this war finally ended. Most of all, she wondered if she had made the right choice by questioning the council's failure to act when New Haven burned. Down in the lower levels of Axiom Prime, in the bars and restaurants where military officers and merchant captains gathered, the discussions were less philosophical. Everyone agreed on one thing. Humanity had proven themselves to be absolutely terrifying when someone pushed them too far. The smart species would remember that lesson and make sure they never gave humans a reason to come after them. 8 months after New Haven burned, humanity had destroyed 40% of the Zethrid Collective's military infrastructure and killed over 7 million Zethrid in the process. The numbers grew larger every day as human warships hunted through space and found new targets. Every military base, every shipyard, every supply depot, every communication relay, all of it burned under human weapons that showed no mercy and accepted no surrender. On Earth, the celebrations that had followed the first victories had faded into something darker. People gathered in city squares to watch the news broadcasts showing Zethrid facilities being destroyed, but they no longer cheered. They watched in silence as the death toll climbed higher and higher. Some looked satisfied. Others looked sick. All of them looked tired. The protests started in Seattle and spread across the planet within days. Thousands marched through the streets carrying signs that read things like "Not in our name" and "We are becoming the monsters and stop the killing." They demanded that the government negotiate with the Zethrid. They insisted that humanity was losing its soul in pursuit of revenge. The counter-protests started just as quickly. Veterans of the resource wars stood in opposition with their own signs reading, "Remember New Haven and they started this, and 50,000 dead deserve justice." Both groups shouted at each other across police barricades while the war continued in space above their heads. Director Peter Hayes received death threats from both sides. Peace activists called him a war criminal. Military supporters called him weak for not pushing the offensive harder. He stopped reading his messages after the first 100 and focused on running the war effort from his office in Geneva. The United Earth Council met in closed session to discuss the situation. The session lasted 14 hours and got heated enough that security had to be called twice to separate council members who came close to physical violence. When it was over, Director Hayes emerged to address the media and the billions watching around the world. He stood at the podium and looked directly into the cameras with eyes that had not seen real sleep in months. He told them that he understood the concerns about the conduct of the war. He acknowledged that the casualties were horrifying. He admitted that humanity was doing things that would have been unthinkable just a year ago. Then he told them about what the Zethrid had done at New Haven in detail that had been kept from the public before. He described how the alien ships had systematically targeted schools and hospitals. He explained how they had hunted down escape pods fleeing the planet and destroyed every single one. He revealed that the Zethrid message after the attack had not been apologetic or regretful. It had been a threat promising more death if humanity did not submit to their territorial claims. His voice never rose above a conversational tone, but his words hit like hammer blows. He asked the protesters what they would have humanity do. Negotiate with species who murdered children as a legal enforcement action. Accept territorial limits imposed by those who thought human life was disposable. Trust that the Zethrid would honor any agreement when they had shown such contempt for human existence. He finished by saying that the price of survival was becoming something that humanity did not want to be. But survival came first. Everything else was secondary. The galaxy had shown humans that civilization was optional, peace was temporary, mercy was weakness. So humanity would be strong. They would be merciless. They would be whatever they needed to be to ensure that no other species would ever look at humans and think they could be exterminated without consequences. The broadcast ended and the protests continued, but they were smaller after that. Most people went back to their lives and tried not to think too hard about what was being done in their name among the stars. Lieutenant Commander Greg Palmer served aboard the ECS Vengeance, one of the newer warships that had been rushed into service to support the offensive. He had been a cargo pilot before the war, flying supplies between Earth and Mars on boring routes that paid well and kept him safe. Now he sat at a weapons console and pulled triggers that ended lives by the thousands. The Vengeance dropped out of faster-than-light travel in the Zeta Reticuli system and immediately detected a large civilian transport trying to flee toward the outer planets. The ship was enormous, easily 10 times the size of the Vengeance, and sensors showed it was packed with refugees. Zethrid civilians running from the war zone and trying to reach safety deeper in their own territory. Captain Elizabeth Foster ordered the weapons crews to prepare to fire. Greg looked at his display and saw the thermal signatures of thousands of individual Zethrid packed into that transport. He saw the smaller signatures of what had to be children grouped together in certain sections. He saw the engine signature showing that the transport was running at maximum speed and starting to break apart from the stress. He asked the captain if she was sure about this. The transport was clearly civilian. It posed no military threat. It was just families trying to survive. Captain Foster looked at him with eyes that held no warmth or sympathy. She told him that the Zethrid at New Haven had been civilians too. They had posed no military threat either. They had just been families trying to survive. The Zethrid had shown no mercy then, and humanity would show no mercy now. Greg wanted to refuse. He wanted to stand up and tell her that this was wrong, that killing refugees made humans just as bad as the enemy they were fighting. But he thought about his sister who had died at New Haven. She had been a nurse at the medical center. She had probably been helping patients when the building collapsed on top of her. He armed his weapons and waited for the firing solution to lock. When it did, he pressed the trigger and watched missiles streak across space toward the refugee transport. The first impacts breached the hull and exposed entire sections to vacuum. The second wave of missiles hit the engines and the transport exploded in a fireball that lit up the darkness. Greg watched the debris spread out in an expanding sphere and knew that he had just murdered thousands of innocent people. He wrote in his personal log that night that he had followed orders like he always did. But he also wrote that he no longer recognized himself in the mirror. He wondered if this was how soldiers felt in all the old wars back on Earth. The ones who did terrible things because someone with authority told them it was necessary. The Galactic Council issued an ultimatum to humanity 3 days later. The message was broadcast on every frequency, and translated into human languages by their best linguists. It demanded that humanity cease all hostilities immediately and withdraw all forces from Zethrid space. It threatened intervention by the combined fleet if humans did not comply within one standard galactic week. General Linda Carter received the ultimatum in her command center on Luna. She read it once, then saved it to a file labeled garbage and deleted it. Her staff watched her do this and waited to see what she would say. She told them that the Galactic Council had their chance to intervene when New Haven burned. They could have stopped the Zethrid. They could have enforced their precious conventions and laws. Instead, they had filed a report and moved on like 50,000 human deaths were just paperwork to be processed. Now they wanted to threaten humanity with military force for refusing to roll over and die quietly. They could bring their combined fleet. They could bring all 12 species and every warship they had. Humanity would fight them all if necessary because humans had learned the most important lesson the galaxy could teach. Nobody was coming to save you. Nobody cared if you lived or died unless you made them care. The only way to survive in this galaxy was to be so dangerous that everyone else was too afraid to attack you. She turned to her operations officer, Major Lisa Monroe, and told her to prepare the fleet for Operation Final Answer. They were going to take the war straight to the Zethrid homeworld and show the entire galaxy what humanity did to species who thought humans could be exterminated without cost. Major Monroe pulled up the star chart showing the route to Zeth Prime and began calculating jump coordinates. The invasion fleet would be the largest force humanity had ever assembled. 200 warships, 50,000 crew members, enough firepower to destroy a planet. General Carter looked at the display showing Zeth Prime and its 4.6 billion inhabitants. She thought about New Haven and its 50,000 dead. The math did not balance, but the message would be clear enough. Nobody attacked humanity without paying a price. Not now, not ever. The human fleet arrived at Zeth Prime with 200 warships and enough weapons to crack the planet's crust, if they chose to use them all at once. General Linda Carter stood on the bridge of the ECS Retribution and looked at the blue and green world filling the view screen ahead. 4.6 billion Zethrid lived down there. It was their homeworld, the place where their species had evolved and built their first cities and eventually reached for the stars. The Zethrid defense fleet moved to intercept immediately. 300 ships of various sizes formed a defensive wall between the human fleet and their homeworld. They broadcast warnings and threats and demands for the humans to leave immediately, or face destruction. Their commanders probably believed they could win because they outnumbered the human fleet and they were fighting to defend their home. General Carter opened a communication channel that broadcast on every frequency the Zethrid used. Her message was simple and direct. She told them that humanity had come to Zeth Prime because the Zethrid had come to New Haven. She reminded them that they had killed 50,000 humans without warning or mercy. She explained that they had threatened humanity with more violence if humans dared to expand beyond their own solar system. Now humans were here to show them what that threat had cost. The Zethrid fleet commander responded by opening fire, and the battle began in earnest. Space around Zeth Prime became a graveyard within minutes. Ships on both sides exploded under concentrated fire. Debris fields expanded in all directions as hulls breached and reactors overloaded. Human ships used their superior weapons, technology to devastating effect, but the Zethrid fought with the desperation of a species facing extinction. Captain Nicole Brooks commanded the Retribution through the battle with cold precision. Her ship took hits that would have destroyed smaller vessels, but the heavy armor held, and the damage control teams kept critical systems running. She targeted the largest Zethrid ships first, the ones that posed the greatest threat, and watched them break apart under sustained fire from her main batteries. The battle lasted 4 hours, and when it was over, both fleets were shattered. The Zethrid had lost 200 ships and thousands of crew members. The humans had lost 70 ships and nearly 20,000 people. But the human fleet still had enough ships and weapons left to threaten the planet below, while the Zethrid defense fleet had been effectively destroyed. On the planet's surface, 4.6 billion Zethrid watched the battle in their skies and understood for the first time what true fear felt like. Their entire history, they had been the strong ones, the ones who expanded and claimed territory and enforced their will on others. Now another species had come to their homeworld and beaten their defenders and hung in orbit like a sword waiting to fall. General Carter opened another communication channel. this time directed at the Zethrid High Command on the surface. She told them they had 12 hours to begin evacuating their homeworld. She explained that humanity was going to destroy Zeth Prime, not because they had to, but because they could. Because the Zethrid needed to understand what they had unleashed when they decided human lives were disposable. The Zethrid High Command responded with offers of negotiation. They promised reparations for New Haven. They offered to cede territory. They suggested prisoner exchanges and peace talks. They tried everything they could think of to avoid what was coming. General Carter rejected every offer. She told them that the time for negotiation had been before they attacked New Haven. The time for mercy had been when they were burning children in their schools. Now the only choice the Zethrid had was whether their people would be on the planet when humanity destroyed it, or safely evacuated to other worlds. The evacuation began within an hour. Thousands of ships lifted from spaceports across Zeth Prime, carrying refugees toward orbital stations and neighboring colony worlds, civilian transports, cargo haulers, personal spacecraft. Anything that could fly and carry passengers joined the exodus. The human fleet did not interfere. They simply waited and watched and kept their weapons trained on the planet below. Ambassador Kelly Stevens arrived at Axiom Prime on a small diplomatic shuttle while the evacuation was still ongoing. She had been a lawyer before the war, specializing in international law and human rights. Now she represented humanity to the Galactic Council, and her job was to explain why her species was threatening to destroy a planet with billions of inhabitants. The council chamber was packed with delegates from every member species. They all wanted to hear what the human ambassador had to say. Many of them had already decided that humanity needed to be stopped by force if necessary. A few were quietly hoping that humans would follow through and teach the Zethrid a lesson that the council had been too timid to enforce. Sally stood at the central podium with Zeth Prime displayed on the holographic screens behind her. She could see the streams of ships fleeing the planet like blood flowing from a wound. She took a breath and began speaking in a voice that carried clearly through the translation systems. She told them that the Council had asked humanity to be civilized, to follow their rules and conventions, to accept that the murder of 50,000 humans was a legal enforcement action under galactic law. She asked them what humanity had learned from that experience. The Council chamber remained silent, so she answered her own question. Humanity had learned that civilization was a luxury, that conventions meant nothing to those who had never faced extinction, that if humans wanted to survive in the galaxy, they could not afford to be the weak ones who could be killed without consequence. She explained that the Zethrid had 12 hours to evacuate their homeworld. After that, humanity would demonstrate what happened when you took away everything that made them civilized. Every species watching needed to understand that this was not who humans wanted to be. This was who the galaxy had made them become. Ambassador Trell of the Vaxian Union stood and demanded to know if humanity truly intended to destroy a planet. Kelly looked at him directly and told him that humanity intended to do exactly what they had promised. The Zethrid would lose their homeworld as punishment for destroying New Haven, and as a warning to every other species that might consider humans an acceptable target. High Arbiter Senna asked if there was anything the Council could do to prevent this catastrophe. Kelly told her that the time for the Council to act had been 8 months ago when New Haven burned. Now it was too late for intervention. The galaxy would have to live with the consequences of ignoring genocide when it was convenient. The 12 hours expired, and General Carter gave the order she had been dreading since this operation began. The human fleet fired a coordinated volley at specific targets across Zeth Prime. They did not try to destroy the planet completely. Instead, they targeted the capital city where the High Command had refused to evacuate. They destroyed the planetary defense network. They collapsed the orbital elevator that connected the surface to space stations above. The capital city of Zeth Prime, empty now except for the High Command who had chosen to stay, became a crater visible from orbit. The damage was severe enough to render the planet uninhabitable for generations, but not enough to actually break the world apart. It was a demonstration of power and restraint combined in equal measure. General Carter broadcast one final message to the Zethrid and to every species in the galaxy listening. She told them that humanity had shown mercy by allowing the evacuation. She explained that humans could have destroyed the entire planet and everyone on it, but had chosen not to. She wanted everyone to understand that this restraint was not weakness, it was a choice. and that choice could be revoked if anyone threatened humanity again. The war ended not with humanity's destruction, but with the galaxy's understanding that humans would go further than anyone else when pushed. That humanity's capacity for violence when unleashed knew no conventional bounds. That attacking humans carried a cost that no one else was willing to pay. The Galactic Council convened again, and this time humanity was invited to the table as a full member. The peace terms were simple and non-negotiable. The Zethrid Collective would pay reparations for New Haven. They would cede disputed territory. They would disarm their forward fleets and accept monitoring to ensure compliance. Every species in the galaxy signed the New Terran Convention, which added crucial language to galactic law. Any act of genocide against a spacefaring species constituted an existential threat and authorized unlimited response under the doctrine of survival necessity. The law was written in human blood and Zethrid suffering, and no one doubted it would be enforced. Commander Jake Morrison stood at the New Haven Memorial on Earth 1 year after the attack. Behind him, 50,000 names were carved in black stone. He thought about the millions of Zethrid who had died in the war that followed. He thought about the human soldiers who would never be the same after the things they had done. He thought about the price humanity had paid for survival. A young reporter approached and asked if it had been worth it. All those deaths and destruction just for revenge. Jake looked at her for a long moment before answering. He told her it was not revenge because revenge was personal.